A homeless man played his guitar on the sidewalk. Seconds later, a music producer stopped in his tracks. What happened next? No one saw it coming. The city was alive with movement, cars honking, people shuffling past each other, lost in their own worlds. Deadlines, meetings, schedules, everyone rushing, no time for distractions. But amidst the controlled chaos, something cut through the noise. A guitar. Not just background strumming or some amateur street performance. This was different. It was raw, real. Each note carried weight, like a story being told through the strings. The kind of sound that stopped you, even if just for a second. Cameron Ellis, a black music producer with an ear trained for greatness, wasn't one to waste time. He had places to be, deals to finalize, talent to scout. But his feet slowed before he even realized why. He turned his head, following the sound to the edge of the sidewalk. There, tucked between a row of storefronts, sat a man. A worn-out flannel, ripped jeans, and boots that had seen better days. White, late 50s, maybe 60s. The kind of face that looked like it had lived several lives. But his fingers, they moved with precision, with emotion. The guitar was old, the wood cracked in places. But it didn't matter. The way he played, the way his voice rasped through the melody, made everything else fade away. People passed without a second glance. A woman with shopping bags glanced down before quickly looking away. A businessman in a navy suit stepped over the man's guitar case like it was part of the pavement. A group of teenagers whispered and snickered before moving along. But Cameron stood still. The melody climbed and fell, thick with pain and history. This wasn't just music. This was someone's soul, bleeding into the strings. And yet, nobody seemed to care. But Cameron did. He didn't know why yet. He just knew that something about this moment was bigger than him. And that's why he stepped forward. Cameron wasn't sure what he was doing. Stopping for a street musician? That wasn't in his nature. He'd seen hundreds of hopefuls in the industry, some desperate for a shot, others clinging to past dreams. But something about this man, his sound, his presence, made it impossible to walk away. He stepped closer, watching as the man's fingers danced across the strings, his voice rich with grit, weaving through the melody like it had nowhere else to go. When the song ended, there was no applause, no recognition, just the city moving on. Cameron crouched down. That was something else, man. The guitarist looked up, squinting against the sunlight. His eyes were tired, lined with years of something deeper than just age. Yeah? His voice was rough, like someone who had spent too many nights with whiskey and too many days with regret. Cameron nodded. Yeah. He gestured toward the guitar. Where'd you learn to play like that? The man chuckled, shaking his head. A long time ago. Another life. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was heavy, like there was too much story to fit into a simple answer. Cameron glanced at the guitar again. You got a name? The man exhaled, as if saying it out loud meant confronting whatever had led him to this spot. Jack. Jack what? Just Jack. Cameron nodded slowly, accepting that. All right, just Jack. You ever record anything? Jack's fingers flexed over the strings, his jaw tightening for just a second before he let out a quiet laugh. Once upon a time. Cameron waited. He could feel there was more. Jack sighed, staring at the sidewalk like it held pieces of his past. I was a session guitarist. Played for some big names, real big names. If you listened to rock or blues back in the 90s, you probably heard me without even knowing it. He paused, his voice dipping lower. But the industry doesn't care about ghosts. Cameron knew that was true. He'd seen it happen. One bad decision, one stroke of bad luck, and you disappeared. What happened? He asked. Jack hesitated. Life. Bad deals. Bad habits. Some people you trust end up not being so trustworthy. He rubbed his face. Lost everything. Been out here ever since. Cameron studied him, the weight of his words settling in. This man wasn't just talented. He was someone who had been chewed up and spit out by an industry that only remembered you when you were useful. Jack strummed idly, the notes drifting into the air, ignored by everyone except Cameron. "You still got it," Cameron said finally. Jack huffed out a laugh. "That don't mean much when you're playing to nobody." Cameron leaned back on his heels, an idea forming. "What if I changed that?" Jack squinted at him. "What do you mean?" Cameron pulled out his phone. "Let's find out." And with that, everything was about to shift. Cameron wasn't the type to act on impulse. In the music industry, everything was calculated. Timing, connections, marketability. But right now, standing on this cracked sidewalk with a man who had nothing but a guitar and a past, instinct took over. He hit record. Jack hesitated, his fingers pausing over the strings. "What are you doing?" Cameron shrugged. "Just play." Jack let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. But then, his fingers moved, and the music took over. This time, Cameron really listened. The way Jack's voice stretched over the chords, not just singing, but feeling. It was something money couldn't buy. The kind of sound that made you stop in your tracks and rethink everything you thought you knew about talent. A few passers-by slowed, glancing at the man they had ignored just moments before. A young woman took out her phone and started recording. An older man in a baseball cap tapped his foot, nodding along. Jack wasn't just playing, he was telling a story. By the time the song ended, there were a few dollars tossed into his open guitar case. But that wasn't the real reward. Cameron looked down at his phone, watching the numbers climb. "Damn," he muttered. Jack smirked, rubbing the back of his hand over his stubbled face. "What?" Cameron turned the screen toward him. "You just got 100,000 views in 5 minutes." Jack squinted. "Is that good?" Cameron laughed. "Man, that's insane." But it didn't stop. By the time they made it to a coffee shop down the block, the video had hit 1 million views, then 2, then 5. Comments flooded in, people desperate to know who Jack was, where they could find his music, how the hell he wasn't famous. And then the first message came in. Cameron's jaw clenched as he read the name on the screen. "You ever hear of Vince Holloway?" Jack flinched. That was all the answer Cameron needed. "Yeah," Jack muttered. "I know Vince." Cameron stared at him. "He just sent me a message. Wants to talk to you." Jack exhaled sharply, eyes flicking toward the door like he was considering running. Cameron leaned forward. "Who is he to you?" Jack's hands flexed around his coffee cup. "The guy who took everything from me." And just like that, this wasn't just a story anymore. This was personal. Jack stared at the screen, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. The name Vince Holloway wasn't just a name. It was a memory, one that stung like an old wound never fully healed. Cameron saw it. He had been in this business long enough to know when someone was sitting on a story they'd rather not tell. "Talk to me," he said. "Who is Vince to you?" Jack exhaled, rubbing his temple like the weight of it all was pressing down on him again. "Used to be my best friend." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. We came up together, played in the same bars, wrote songs in the same basements. Then, when the deals started coming in, he got smart, knew how to work people. I just cared about the music. Cameron nodded. He'd seen it happen before. One guy gets hungry for the fame, the other gets left behind. Jack's jaw tightened. I wrote half his first album. Every song. We were supposed to split everything. He let out a bitter laugh. Then one day, I get a call from my lawyer. Turns out I signed away my rights without knowing it. My name? Gone. My credit? Gone. My money? Gone. Cameron leaned back. Damn. Jack ran a hand over his face. And when I tried to fight it, blacklisted. No label, no gigs, no nothing. Next thing I knew, I was playing for drinks in bars that wouldn't even put my name on the flyer. His voice dipped lower. That's when I started drinking. Hard. Silence settled between them, the weight of Jack's words thick in the air. Then Cameron's phone buzzed again. Another notification. More messages. More people watching. He turned the screen toward Jack. "Man, whether you like it or not, you're back." Jack shook his head. "Nah, I ain't back. I'm a nobody with a guitar and a viral video." Cameron leaned in. "Not for long." Jack scoffed, but there was something else in his expression now. Something like fear. Cameron didn't push, he just made the call. The studio wasn't fancy. It wasn't a major label setup, just a small independent spot Cameron used when he wanted real music. No gimmicks, no industry vultures. Just a room, a mic, and soundproof walls. Jack stepped inside and froze. The smell of old wood and warm vinyl hit him first. The walls were lined with guitars, each one gleaming under the dim light. A mic stood in the center of the room, waiting. Jack swallowed hard. "I don't know about this." Cameron crossed his arms. "Why not?" Jack exhaled. "Because if I suck, then what? At least on the street, I got an excuse." Cameron nodded. "Fair. But what if you don't suck?" Jack let out a shaky laugh, shaking his head. "Man, I haven't been in a place like this in years." Cameron pointed to the chair. "Then sit down. Pick up that guitar, and remind yourself who the hell you are." Jack hesitated. Then slowly he sat. The first few notes were shaky. His fingers stumbled. His voice cracked. But then, something clicked. And when Jack finally closed his eyes and let go, the sound that came out of him wasn't just good. It was undeniable. And Cameron knew. The world was about to hear it. The studio was silent. The kind of silence that comes right before something big. Jack took a breath, gripping the guitar tighter, his fingers finding the familiar grooves on the worn-out wood. His hands weren't as steady as they once were. His voice wasn't as smooth. But when he played, it didn't matter. The first note rang out, soft but full, the kind of sound that hits you right in the chest. Cameron watched from the other side of the glass, arms crossed, barely breathing. And then, Jack sang. It wasn't perfect. It was better. His voice cracked in places, but that only made it feel more real. His lyrics, raw and unfiltered, wove a story of love lost, friendships broken, dreams slipping through the cracks. Every word held the weight of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, but still had something to give. Cameron felt it. And he wasn't alone. The sound engineer, a guy who had been in the business long enough to be impossible to impress, just sat there, staring at the console, eyes wide. By the time Jack hit the last chord, the room was dead silent. Then Cameron hit the talk button. "Jack." Jack exhaled, shoulders still tight. "Yeah?" "Look up." Jack glanced through the glass and froze. Because behind Cameron in the control room stood Vince Holloway. Jack's fingers slipped off the strings. What the hell is he doing here? Cameron didn't blink. "He called me, said he wanted to see you play." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, bet he did. Probably looking for one last thing to steal." But Vince didn't say anything. He just stood there, eyes locked on Jack, like he was seeing a ghost. And then he nodded. Jack scoffed, shaking his head. "What, that's it?" A nod. Cameron leaned closer to the mic. "Jack. He's crying." Jack looked again, and for the first time in decades, he saw something in Vince's face he never expected. Regret. Genuine, bone-deep regret. Cameron pressed the button again. "He wants to talk." Jack swallowed hard. His whole body was tense. But then, he set the guitar down, and he walked toward the control room. Because some ghosts, you have to face. Jack stepped into the control room, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. Vince stood there, silent, waiting. The man looked different from the last time Jack had seen him. Older, worn down. Like life had taken just as much from him as it had from Jack. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Too many years. Too much history. Then Vince exhaled. "You sound exactly the same." His voice was hoarse, low. "Maybe even better." Jack crossed his arms. "Didn't know you cared." Vince let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. I should have. He paused, shaking his head. Jack, He stopped himself, like the weight of what he wanted to say was too much. Then he tried again. I screwed you over. I know that. Jack's jaw clenched. Yeah, you did. I was selfish, greedy. I thought if I didn't take the credit, someone else would. And I told myself you'd be fine, that you'd bounce back. Vince swallowed. But I was wrong. Jack scoffed. You think saying sorry fixes anything? No, Vince said quickly. I don't. He met Jack's eyes. But I've spent the last 10 years trying to make it right. And when I saw that video, I knew this was my last chance. Jack stared at him, waiting. Vince took a slow breath. I still own the rights to those songs. I never sold them. I want to give them back to you. Jack's heart stopped. What? Vince pulled out a folder from his bag, his hands shaking as he held it out. Your name. Your music. Everything you should have had back then. I want you to have it. Jack didn't move. He just stared at the folder, his past sitting right there in front of him, waiting to be reclaimed. Cameron watched from the side, arms crossed, saying nothing. This wasn't his moment to interfere. Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides. He could have cursed Vince out, could have thrown the papers back in his face, but instead, he asked himself a question. What did he really want? To be angry forever? To hold on to a grudge so tight that it crushed him? Or did he want to be free? Jack took the folder, not for Vince, for himself. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then Jack did something neither of them expected. He held out his hand. Vince blinked, like he didn't trust what he was seeing. But slowly, carefully, he took it. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a start. A month later, Jack stood on stage for the first time in over 20 years. The lights were blinding. The crowd was massive. Thousands of people who had seen that video, who had felt something when they heard his music, who were here to see him, not as a street performer, not as a nobody, but as an artist. Cameron stood in the wings, arms crossed, watching. Proud. Jack adjusted the strap on his guitar, took a deep breath, and then he played. The first note rang out, clear and strong. The audience roared. Jack's fingers found their rhythm. His voice carried over the speakers, and for the first time in decades he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And this time, no one could take it from him. Sometimes, second chances don't come the way you expect, but when they do, you take them. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe and share. You never know who might need to hear this.